Welcome to Casting Class, the engineer's podcast for all things metal casting. Casting Class is brought to you by Batesville Products, the manufacturing experts who have been casting, machining, and polishing custom aluminum components for over 75 years. So today we have Rachel Weber here to talk about two common metal casting processes, investment casting and permanent mold. So we talk a lot about permanent mold in this podcast, and that's just because that's our expertise. So let's switch it up a little bit. Let's start with investment casting. So Rachel, can you give us an overview of what exactly investment casting is?
Sure. So investment casting is a metal casting process that uses a wax pattern to create a part with high dimensional accuracy and smooth surface finish.
Nice. So another name for investment casting that we hear thrown around is precision casting or lost wax casting. Why do people call investment casting? What do those names derive from?
Sure. So we can start with lost wax. So the reason they call it that is because you're using wax material to create the initial part. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to have a mold where you're going to cast in the wax to create the part shape, and then you're going to take that part, hang it on a tree, which then will be dripped multiple times through ceramic process. And through that, you're going to essentially take your molten metal and you're going to pour it into the top of the cavity of this ceramic shell. And through the process, you're going to melt out the wax, and the metal is going to take over where the wax was, calling it lost wax process.
It's kind of similar going through that casting process. It's kind of similar to sand casting in the way that you're not getting a reusable mold. It's a one-time use.
Yes.
So in order to get that part out, they have to break that ceramic shell every
Correct.
time.
Yes.
So that's a little different from permanent mold. Can you walk through the permanent mold casting process and kind of how that differs?
Sure. So similar to investment and sand, you're going to have your initial mold. But the difference is that you're starting with a steel mold, and your steel mold is going to go through the whole process. So you're going to have your cope and drag, and when you put them into the press, they'll be nice, tight, snug, and closed. And you'll cast your metal into a pour cup, which then the operator at the time most are hydraulics, so you'll hit a button and it'll tilt back for the metal to pour into the cavity of the mold. It'll solidify, you'll tilt it back, and then you'll open up the mold and you'll have your part. So it's a little different than sand versus investment casting, where you're going to have to break apart a shell mold or a sand mold to get your part out. This, you're just opening and closing a steel tool to grab the part out.
Yeah, overall it sounds like the investment casting process has a lot more steps to it. It seems like a very complex process.
Yes. So while the tooling you can get expensive in tooling with investment casting, you're not going to hit quite the permanent mold tooling cost, but you're going to make up for it in the labor cost for sure, because you have got a lot more steps in the process in investment casting to get to your end part.
Yeah, so let's jump into that a little bit there. So because there's a difference in these processes, that means that some designs or some applications lend themselves to one process more than another.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at casting designs every single day, and you kind of help people point in the right direction of what their best manufacturing option is. So what are some things that you look for that you would say this would be a better suited as an investment casting, or this would be better suited for permanent mold?
Size is one, depending upon how big or small the casting is. If you're looking at smaller parts with higher surface finish as cast finish, I would definitely push towards investment or die casting. And then quantity is where you kind of break apart the two. So if you're lower quantity, you would go with investment casting, versus higher quantity, you would want to go with die casting. And really, on the quantities, most foundries will give you an idea of what they can handle.
Yeah, so permanent mold is better for the moderate volume. So more than 500 pieces.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing less, you might want to look at investment casting or sand casting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned size, volume. Are there any industries that you see more on permanent mold or more on investment?
So one really good example of investment casting is jewelry. A lot of jewelers use the lost wax or investment casting process due to the size of the parts. They tend to be a lot smaller in quantities. And then
another
aerospace.
reason for the jewelry too is the detail.
Yes, fine detail. Yeah.
So investment casting has a very both processes are well known for their precision, but investment casting can really get down to that more detail and, like you said earlier, the finer surface finish.
Yes. And one big difference between investment versus permanent mold is surface finish. Is you can get up to a 60 RMS surface finish on a investment casting, while in permanent mold, I would say 200 is where a nice surface finish would hit.
Mm-hmm. Which you can always add secondaries in both processes. You can add polishing or machining or heat treat, any type of secondaries to kind of combat those as cast finishes.
Yeah.
So overall, it sounds like there's pros and cons to each casting method.
Yeah.
It really depends on what your overall goal is for each part and what you're trying to create.
Correct.
It sounds like investment casting is ideal for low volume production where detail is key, getting those complex shapes, small parts, not parts that are too big or too heavy. And it sounds like permanent mold is really ideal for that moderate volume. You still want to hold high dimensional accuracy, bigger parts, commonly seen in like medical or the food industry. Let's talk a little bit about cost. So that's something that a lot of people weigh when they're looking at the two, which process to use. So can you talk a little bit about the cost difference?
Yeah. So on the molding side, you're going to see more expensive tooling cost for permanent mold just due to the size of and the amount of steel you're going to be using. While on the piece price, you're going to see more expensive piece price on the investment casting side due to the labor specifically that goes into making an investment casting and the additional material needed in the casting process, because you're not only do you have the tool, but you also have the tree, the wax, and the ceramic that all goes into making the parts. While permanent mold, you might have a very expensive tool, but you just have the tool and to cast into. The only material that you're going to be paying for would be the labor and the metal that you choose to cast.
Yeah, so with investment casting, with that, all those steps in the process, all of the materials in the process, the cost is going to add up the more pieces that you go.
Yeah.
And then permanent mold casting, you have a reusable steel tool.
Correct.
So you might have a higher tooling cost, but lower piece price. Investment casting, lower tooling cost, higher piece price.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to add about pros, cons, when to use?
I will say I think investment casting is a great option if you are looking to get into the casting process but aren't ready to commit to an expensive tool, and if it's on the smaller side. Whereas the same would go if you have a larger part, you would maybe want to look at sand casting. But once you start getting into the higher quantities, that's when you want to start looking at permanent mold or even die casting for your next casting process, just to help lower your piece price.
Thank you, Rachel, for helping walk through these two common casting methods. For those of you listening, so you might have heard us mention two other common methods, the sand casting and the die casting. We talk a little bit more about those on our website and in other podcast episodes. So if you're interested in learning more about those, you can go to batesvilleproducts.com or our YouTube channel. But anyway, that's all we have for today. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Casting Class, the engineer's podcast for all things metal casting. For more episodes, videos, and guides, check out batesvilleproducts.com. See you next month.